Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome to What's Left. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next almost half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that are hopefully be of some interest to you. As always, any comments, questions, reactions, they can be sent to me directly. My personal email right here is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. The URL will be here a couple of times during the show. You can leave a comment there if you'd like. If you do email me, though, two quick favors. Please include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, and to be a little patient about getting an answer. And with that necessary stuff out of the way, let's get to it. This being our first show of 2017, we're going to do something, we're going to do one of those look back at the year preceding shows that are so popular this time of year. But actually, before even we get to that, I'm going to run through some bits of good news, both because we always like to start the show that way when we can, and also because since so many of us were rather glad to see 2016 go, I thought we'd try to get 2017 off to a good start. So, one piece of good news is that support for the death penalty continues to decline. In 2016, a total of 20 inmates were executed. That is the fewest since 1991, and also only 5 states accounted for all of those sanctioned killings. What's more, the number of new death sentences imposed in 2016 was only 30, which is also down substantially. The modern year peak in 1996, there were 315 death sentences. Now, a plurality, not a majority, but a plurality of Americans still oppose the death penalty. By latest polls, it's about 49% in favor and 42% opposed. That actually is the lowest level of support in 44 years. And actually, support for the death penalty dropped 7 percentage points between mid-2015 and late 2016. Which, all this is a trend. These are all trends that I hope will continue throughout 2017. Next up, very quickly, a Pew Research poll taken the first week of December says that 59% of Americans favor stricter environmental laws and regard the costs involved as worth it. A majority in all age groups under 65 and at all levels of education agreed with that contention. And for some more good news, take us into 2017. Here's another poll from Pew Research. This one actually, the results that actually surprised me. A slim majority of Americans, which means we're about half and half because once you allow for the margin of error in a poll, but their margin was 51% to 49%, which means basically an even split. But transgender people, this poll said, should be allowed to use the restroom that accords with their gender identity rather than being forced to use the one with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And this actually did surprise me because usually it takes time, it takes like at least a generation or more for an idea that affects social roles and identities to gain a good degree of support. The fact that this relatively new idea of respecting gender identity has not only become mainstream, but actually has such a high level of support, I actually find that rather encouraging. Next up, a couple of weeks ago, President Obama signed legislation that for the first time extended protections against religious persecution to people with non-theistic beliefs, including those who subscribe to no religion at all, including, in the words of the bill, non-theists, humanists, and atheists. Now, note what's particularly important here. This is not some executive order. This is a bill, a law, passed out of Congress with bipartisan support. It intends to offer greater protection to believers of all sorts around the world, but the specific inclusion of non-believers is an historic first. Finally, you likely know about this, so I'll just mention it very quickly. On December 20th, Obama used his authority under a 1950s-era law called the Outer Continental Shelf Act to protect some 120 million acres of federal waters from oil and gas drilling in the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans. Obama's environmental record surely could have been a lot better, but at least he's going out on a high note. All right, now let's get to that year in review thing I was talking about. And since we're talking about good news, we're going to announce our choice for Good News of the Year for 2016. Now, the choice here wasn't so obvious as it was a year ago. The good news for the year for 2015 was pretty obviously the Supreme Court decision that declared bans on same-sex marriage to be unconstitutional. This year, there didn't seem to be any one story that stood out from the others the way that one did. Nonetheless, we did have some good news this year, although at times it might not have felt that way. We did, for example, see 3 developments in matters of health and science that we covered on the show here that I think are important. One was a potential breakthrough in the treatment of Alzheimer's. It's based on the fact that inflammation of the brain, which is associated with Alzheimer's, now appears to be a driver of that condition rather than a result of it. When mice with an Alzheimer's-like condition were treated by addressing the immune cells that are related to the inflammation, the progression of disease stopped. Now note, this is not a prevention for Alzheimer's. It's not a cure. It's a treatment. So it's too soon for celebrations, but based on these results, it is not too soon to move to the step of developing medications based on these discoveries. So this marks it as one of the most hopeful developments in treatment of Alzheimer's in over a decade. Another thing we talked about was reported progress on a cure for type 1 diabetes. Now, type 1 diabetes is where the body does not produce the insulin it needs, as opposed to type 2, where the body produces the insulin but can't use it properly. Researchers working on type 1 have been developing a treatment involving transplanting insulin-producing cells into a patient's body so the body can produce its own insulin. Now, this actually works well. The problem is the body's own immune system destroys those cells. So now researchers are developing what they called an invisibility cloak that keeps the immune system from seeing the implanted cells as foreign bodies. This is a method that worked in mice for nearly 6 months, and this has led to increased confidence, to great confidence, that an improved cloak combined with this method of transplanting cells could effectively, in the foreseeable future, cure type 1 diabetes. The third example on health and science was progress against the guinea worm. That's a parasite found mostly in Africa that rarely kills its victims, but does leave them in debilitating pain. In 1986, the Carter Center began a campaign to end the affliction. At that time, the number of people affected was estimated to be around 3.5 million. By 2012, the number of new cases was down to 1,100. By 2015, that was down to 22. And in the first half of 2016, the number of confirmed cases of guinea worm was 2. From 3.5 million to 2 in 30 years. The guinea worm is on the verge of being only the second disease after smallpox and the first parasitic disease to be eliminated from the human population. Now, also on good news, on a more immediate political issue, there was the good news that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, is dead, or at least is comatose. There are also a number of other victories, too many to go through. Victories legislative, judicial, and by ballot initiative on matters like voting rights, gun control, privacy, the minimum wage. There was even a win for unions at the Supreme Court, of all places. So even where the sky seemed darkest, there were still some breaks in the clouds. Thing is, what I suspect many among us would consider the good news of the year would be again, it may only be temporary, but it is the victory achieved by the courage, determination, faithfulness, and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness of the water protectors at Standing Rock. Now, I didn't devote as much time to that this last year as I should have, partly due to my own shortcomings of getting caught up in week-to-week events rather than following one ongoing event, and partly due to my sense that that story is being told well enough elsewhere. But it surely was one of the top news stories of the year. And the thing is, the true value of this story did not lie in the story itself, not just in the events themselves, and not even in the success of killing, or at the very least delaying, the pipeline project, but the value lay in the movement that made this a story, a movement that showed that the passion for Native American rights is still there, the passion for the environment is still there, the passion about global warming is still there, and most importantly, a passion for justice that can still drive people into the streets in large numbers for the long term is still there. A passion showed that, once again, that people power can stand against the massed might of the state. Despite all that, Standing Rock is not my choice for Good News of the Year 2016. Now, understand this, as in the case of all the awards, this is a personal decision based on how I react to the news. And I'm often struck by how insular we are, how narrow our American worldview is, how little we know about the world around us, how unaware we are of events around the world that don't, at least indirectly, we think, affect us. So when I myself become aware of such a case, I rue my own ignorance and react to it maybe more strongly than I would otherwise. But be that as it may, my choice for Good News of the Year 2016 is the peace settlement reached between the government of Colombia and the rebel group known as FARC, F-A-R-C. In English, it stands for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. This settlement putting, if all goes well, an end to a civil war that has gone on in Colombia for something like 52 years. Over 250,000 people have been killed in this war. I don't know how many more wounded, somewhere between 5 and 8 million forced from their homes. And now it may be ending. And how can that not be good news? Especially because it almost wasn't. The deal was announced in August, but nearly fell apart when a plebiscite on October 2nd that was expected to pass instead narrowly rejected the deal by a margin of 0.4%. But a quickly renegotiated deal between the government and FARC was passed by the Colombian Congress in early December, putting things back on track, at least hopefully. There are still potential snags. For one big one, the failure of the plebiscite, which was, again, expected to pass easily, that threw a monkey wrench into planning for the demobilization of FARC. See, originally, some 16,000 FARC fighters were supposed to turn in their weapons by December 31st, but because of the delay caused by the failure of the plebiscite, the necessary infrastructure at the UN-monitored camps where that's supposed to happen didn't get built in time, so the deadline has been extended to January 10th. But it still means that progress is being made on that front, along with legislative issues, such as the passing of an amnesty law that actually passed just 3 days before the deadline for action. Now, there is another rebel group in Colombia called ELN, which in English it stands for the National Liberation Army. ELN is much smaller than FARC, with about 1,300 fighters as compared to FARC's 16 to 20,000, but it is also in the early stages of peace talks with the government. In March, both sides agreed to talks that were to start in October. Those fell apart when the ELN did not release a hostage it was holding, but a fresh attempt at talks is to take place later this month in Ecuador. All of which means that there are still hills to climb, particularly to overcome the mental scars of decades of war. But a year ago, those hills looked like mountains, which makes the prospect for the end of more than 50 years of civil war in Colombia my choice for Good News of the Year 2016. And we're taking a break. And we are back. Something else we did this year, we had some RIPs, and one of those things that are so popular this year, the people we lost in this last year. Well, we had some RIPs for folks. Generally, we only did RIPs for folks that I felt some kind of connection to in some manner or another. So it's not a terribly long list, but it was just one of the RIPs that we did this past year, just as a reminder. We had one for John Trudell. He was a Native American activist, poet, and author. There was also the artist David Bowie, who I call the artist because it seems too limiting to call him a musician or a singer. We lost Alan Rickman, a very fine actor who I think was generally underappreciated for most of his career. Glenn Frey died this last year. He was a founding member of the Eagles. Then there was Paul Kantner. He was a founding member of Jefferson Airplane and later Jefferson Starship. And on that same day, Senia Tolley Anderson died. This is a name you probably do not know. She was the original lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, but she quit the business because she didn't want to take her infant son on the road to tour, and she was replaced by Grace Slick. I also had an RIP not for a person, but for an organization. Al Jazeera America closed its doors in 2016. Now, Al Jazeera is an internationally respected news organization that thought that in addition to getting an American slant on the news, maybe European slant on the news, Americans might be interested in news with an Arab slant, a view of how the world looks when you're looking from the Middle East rather than at the Middle East. And truth is, this was probably a foolish endeavor from the start, but no matter. Another RIP this year was for Keith Emerson. And if you don't know the name, think Emerson, Lake and Palmer. If you still don't know the name, look him up on YouTube because you are really missing something. He was one of the finest keyboardists of his generation. Another loss was that of Ben Bagdikian, which is another name you may not know, but if you were in journalism, you would know this name. He was perhaps best known to most as the author of The Media Monopoly, a book about how a small number of corporations could control and did control a majority of the news and broadcast media in the U.S. In the first edition of the book in 1983, there were 50 such companies. By the time of the last edition in 2004, there were 5. And then there was Patty Duke, who I assume needs no identification. She died last year. We also lost Dan Berrigan, priest, poet, playwright, philosopher, but best known as protester. He and his younger brother Phil were perhaps the most, and surely among the most, notorious anti-war activists of the Vietnam era. And I had another RIP that was not for a person. In this case, was for a career. Vin Scully announces retirement after 60 years of announcing baseball. And since I grew up listening to him do Brooklyn Dodger games in the 1950s, yeah, I had to mention it. Another name you likely don't know who died this past year was John Zackerly, or just Zach. He was the cool ghoul, and he essentially invented the sort of TV program showing old sci-fi or horror movies that's hosted by a zombie or a vampire or an alien or whatever who would do some sort of shtick across the time of the show. Everyone from Elvira to the Crypt Keeper at Tales from the Crypt to the gang at Mystery Science Theater 3000 to the large number of local cable access hosts who do similar shows around the country, all of those people can, to some degree, trace their roots to John Zackerly. And finally, there was singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen. There are also 2 other people who died last year who, for some reason, I did not do RIPs for. I actually don't know why, but for some reason they didn't get done, but I wanted to mention them here quickly. Muhammad Ali died in 2016, and so did Arnold Palmer. So, RIP to all of you. All right, next up is to give the Clown Award for 2016, but here we have 2 categories. The first is Basic Stupid. That's for people who say or do things that are just so transparently stupid that it leaves you wondering how such a person managed to master the concept of breathing. So, for example, there was the occasion early in the year when, as they've done for every year since 1976, the faculty and staff of Lake Superior State University at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, published a list of words and phrases to be banished because of overuse or general uselessness. It's a yearly, lighthearted chance to express irritation at overused to the point of cliché words and phrases. Well, when an article about this list was published on AOL, the comments included hundreds, and yes, I do mean hundreds, from right-wing nitwits mocking the students of the university as morons who'll never get a good job. And note, the project is done by faculty and staff, not students. They ranted about political correctness, or they posted something along the lines of blank trying to destroy free speech, with the blank filled in with liberals or socialists or Democrats, or most commonly some version of Barack Obama. Then there was the case of federal immigration judge Jack Wheel. There was a class action suit against the federal government seeking to have the government provide appointed counsel for every indigent child who can't afford a lawyer during immigration court proceedings. In a deposition as part of the government's defense against the suit, Judge Wheel argued that providing such counsel is unnecessary because you can do a fair hearing even with toddlers representing themselves in court, claiming, he said, he has taught immigration law to 3- and 4-year-olds. Most recently, there was CNN reporter Christina Alessi, who positively gushed over a panel being assembled to offer monthly advice to the rump on the economy and taxes. She called it really historic and said it provides some very diverse viewpoints, even though it consists entirely of corporate CEOs, providing diverse viewpoints ranging from that of GE to that of GM. But before we announce our winner, we have to make note of a dishonorable mention. This goes to Idaho Governor Butch Otter, who apparently shares the IQ of his namesake without the compensation of the nice fur coat. About 78,000 folks in Idaho fall in the coverage gap between Medicaid and Obamacare subsidies, which is what the Medicaid expansion, which Idaho does not use, that Medicaid expansion was designed to fill that gap. Governor Otter, his mind, said he'd like to see something done along those lines, but he isn't really worried about it because he doesn't agree that there could be people in Idaho dying because they fall in that coverage gap, so they can't afford health insurance, so they can't afford health care. After all, he said, and this is a quote, "I see plenty of people in hospitals and they have insurance and they're in the hospital, but they still die." In other words, because people with health insurance can have incurable conditions, people without health insurance are no worse off at getting health care because, after all, we all die eventually. Now, he could have been Clown of the Year, but it was not to be. Because the winner of the Big Red Nose for the dumbest thing said in 2016, the Clown of the Year, Basic Stupid category, is South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. In January, Governor Vacant Eyes gave the GOP a response to the State of the Union address and got some pushback from the right because she said something about not following the angriest voices. And defending herself after that, she said this, and this is a quote, "We've never in the history of this country passed any laws or done anything based on race or religion." That, my friends, is some truly powerful stupid. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, a very worthy winner of Clown of the Year 2016 Basic Stupid category. Now, our other category for Clown of the Year is Total Jackassery. And as usual, we had some real competition. For example, we had right-wing attorney and self-described no fan of government, Corey Langhofer, who said in February that Justice Antonin Skeletor's opinion on cases then pending before the Supreme Court should still count, even though he died before the final vote was taken. Now, to repeat that, in case you're wondering if you heard it right, Langhofer is proposing that Skeletor should have gotten a vote on cases still pending before the Supreme Court, despite laboring under the handicap of being dead, as deceased as Monty Python's parrot. Then there was a case of Florida Governor Rick Scott, or as we know him around here, Voldemort, who proved that you could be both a crybaby and a bully at the same time. A woman named Kara Jennings gave him quite an earful when she encountered him at a Starbucks one day, berating him for not doing enough to help people and for a failure to create good jobs. Someone videoed part of that encounter and posted it online. Now, it's important Jennings had nothing to do with the video. Nevertheless, a video hit piece on Kara Jennings quickly appeared. The clear result of some quick Oppo research, the video was done by Voldemort's Political Action Committee and was put up on his official YouTube channel. That is, the governor of Florida used the resources of his political campaign machine to launch a personal attack on an individual private citizen because she had the temerity to mouth off to him in a Starbucks. Now, what could top examples like those? Who could be a bigger jackass than either of those? Well, early in the year, New Hampshire State Representative Josh Moore almost looked like a shoo-in, but he had to settle for dishonorable mention. See, New Hampshire, it develops, is one of 33 U.S. states that actually do not have laws against women going topless in public. And this, amid all the crises that might face any state in this country, this is the crisis that Moore thought had to be addressed. He introduced a bill to make a woman showing her nipples in public a case of lewdness and public indecency, with repeat offenders having to register as sex offenders. When State Representative Amanda Bolden objected to the bill, Moore responded on Facebook by saying, and I'm quoting, "If it's a woman's natural inclination to pull her nipple out in public and you support that, then you should have no problem with a man's inclination to stare at it and grab it." Now, what kind of numbskull pervert would even propose such a response? We understand. Josh Moore, jackass. Now, obviously, someone would have to reach way, way up in order to beat that, but there is someone who's a true champion of being a clown. So the winner for Clown of the Year, Total Jackassery category, is GOPR Representative Steve King of Iowa. During the GOPR National Convention in July, he was on an MSNBC panel hosted by Chris Hayes, along with a White House correspondent and Charles Pierce, a writer for Esquire. When Pierce said the convention hall is wired by loud, unhappy, dissatisfied white people, King said Pierce should, and this is a quote, "go back through history and figure out where are these contributions that have been made by these other categories of people that you're talking about. Where did any other subgroup of people contribute more to civilization?" Hayes, clearly taken aback, said, "Then white people?" To which our champion clown said, "Then Western civilization," which he described as rooted in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States of America, in other words, essentially white people, and every place where the footprint of Christianity settled the world. Now, beyond the fact that the very concept of civilization as we understand the term, the very roots of that lie in Mesopotamia, where the first settled communities were, and leaving aside such non-Western inventions as, to cite just a few, astronomy, monetary systems, ink, paper, clocks, the compass, hospitals, the first university, and oh yeah, our modern system of mathematics, which makes our entire modern world possible, unless you would rather be balancing your checkbook in Roman numerals. There is something else the Western world surely contributed that even Stephen King would have to recognize: Christianity. Looking at Steve King, it's hard to believe that so little rational knowledge could be contained in such a fat head. Steve King, Clown of the Year 2016, Total Jackassery category. Now, you may have noticed, we're just about out of time here, you may have noticed the one thing we haven't done. It's the award for the Outrage of the Year for 2016. That's because the Outrage of the Year actually now extends into this year. There are things that are current now that need to be discussed that are related to that, so that we're going to put that off till next week. Next week, we will award the Outrage of the Year for 2016 and talk about how it still is affecting us in 2017. So until then, we will just say to you, as I always like to, you have the best week you possibly can. We will see you next week. And until then, peace.